Welcome back to Wendy Unfiltered, which I co-host with Wendy Ewan. This episode is called The Nomination Battle for Vancouver Kingsway. My name is Charlie Smith, and I've been a BC journalist for more than 30 years. My co-host, Wendy, is a successful entrepreneur, community leader, and former federal and provincial political candidate. She came to Canada from China more than 40 years ago on a CETA scholarship with just $50 in her pocket. Today, we're going to discuss Wendy's pursuit of a federal Liberal nomination in 2006. It's so nice to be back with you, Wendy.
Thanks, Charlie. So great to be back for this episode.
We mentioned in our last podcast that Bill Graham became the interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada after Paul Martin resigned, and that was on election night 2006. And Paul Martin lost the prime ministership to Stephen Harper of the Conservatives. And for many of us, it was like the end of an era for the Liberals when Mr. Martin called it quits.
That's exactly how I see it, Charlie. That period from 1993 to 2006 was an important time in Canadian history. The Liberals accomplished a lot, though. When they first took power, government finances were a mess. It was Paul Martin, the finance minister at the time, who fixed the economy. He was one of Canada's best finance ministers, if not the best one.
You make a good point. The Liberals, it's worth mentioning, also kept Canada out of the US-led war in Iraq. So it must have been exciting to be in the thick of politics at that time.
It certainly was, Charlie. In those days, as the Liberal leader, Paul Martin's rep in BC, I used to travel to Ottawa a lot. Whether it was to attend meetings or being invited to Prime Minister Paul Martin's residence at 24 Sussex Drive for garden parties and so on.
Wow, garden parties with the Prime Minister.
Yes, I love those cool garden parties where you would have a chance to mingle and connect with some great folks from across Canada. I mentioned in the last episode that I used to work pretty closely with Mark Mason. And I also used to work pretty closely with Mike Witherly, who was the representative at the Prime Minister's office for our Western desk. Mike was very effective and helpful as well. He would lay out the Prime Minister's priorities for all of our backroom boys and girls in BC, I remember. I never had to hesitate to pick up the phone and call him whenever I had questions.
That sounds like a really good working relationship. On the whole, I felt that the Liberals did a decent job from 1993 to 2006.
Absolutely. Having lived and done business in Montreal for 10 years, I had always been very impressed and proud of Paul Martin, another great Montrealer who had been overseeing a dramatic fiscal turnaround. The Liberals inherited a record high deficit. Then it was Paul Martin who turned it around and produced 5 consecutive budget structural surpluses.
Yes, and Mr. Martin, let's not forget, was also a G20 father. In 1999, he was chosen by his G7 peers to be the inaugural chair of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. And that's a role created to address global financial stability.
Yes, Paul Martin was in fact very instrumental in recognizing that global economic decision-making could no longer be handled just by the G7. So he ensured that China and India were included in the G20 because their growing populations and expanding economic influence were essential to resolving global financial issues.
Here's another area Mr. Martin was ahead of his time, and it was on Indigenous issues. I remember he brought forward the Kelowna Accord, a 10-year plan to improve the standard of living for Indigenous people across the country.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pity that Paul Martin only served 2 years as our prime minister. But sometimes, people vote for change just for the sake of change. The Liberals had been in power for 13 years, and by then, people simply wanted a change.
I agree, but there was another change that is worth mentioning, and that was the Liberal MP in Vancouver Kingsway, David Emerson. He crossed the floor to join the federal Conservatives and become a minister of international trade in Stephen Harper's government. And I'm wondering, how did the Liberals feel? Did they have a plan for the vacated Vancouver Kingsway riding?
That's a good question, Charlie. You know, many Liberals, as well as many Kingsway voters, were pretty furious. I remember that's when the interim leader decided that the first Liberal nomination race would be in Vancouver Kingsway. That was Emerson's riding. My supporters quickly went to work for the battle ahead. They had been waiting for me to run in this riding all this time, especially after I had stepped aside for David Emerson in 2004.
And that led to a fairly titanic battle between you and a lawyer named Mason Loh. And he was very well known as a 4-time chair of Success. And as you know, it's a huge social services organization serving immigrant communities, and especially the Chinese community.
Yes, you're right, Charlie. Mason definitely had a high profile in the community. During that time, I was a Success Foundation board director. That was 2005, and that happened to be the year right before this 2006 nomination battle. I remember that some people looked at Mason as the favorite because he had such a high profile. But don't forget, as we discussed in the last episode, my team had signed up around 2,000 members in Vancouver Kingsway by then. And that was before the 2004 election.
Yeah, and 2,000 members. That's a lot of members.
Thank you, Charlie. Yes. And, all we had to do was to ask my supporters to renew their membership and sign up more. And while I was the leaders rep, I also reached out to the community by attending lots of events and made many new contacts. And that was helpful as well.
Those are good points. But let's not forget, Mason Loh was an establishment figure. He was from Hong Kong. He had lots of ties to elite organizations in BC. And his father headed the Vancouver branch of Yanjin Qigong Association, and that was very famous, especially in the Chinese community. And they had, at a minimum, 1,000 serious followers in Vancouver alone.
Wow, you're so plugged in, Charlie. I didn't know you were even aware of this.
Well, he was also well known in the legal community, as you know. His team might have looked at you as more of an outsider, even though you had been in Canada for more than 20 years by that point, and you'd been very successful in business.
That's an interesting observation, Charlie.
And you're also an insider within the Paul Martin camp, so that doesn't make you an outsider, and you also raised lots of money for his campaign. Plus, you were actively volunteering on various boards in leadership roles with Red Cross, Success, Richmond Economic Advisory Committee, etc.
Oh, thank you for all of that. Yeah, so all of that didn't seem to count, eh?
Why do you think that was the case? And this may be a sensitive question, but do you think that it has something to do with you coming from China, and that in itself would make you lesser in some people's eyes?
Oh, that's an interesting way to raise a question, Charlie. I honestly don't think we have a cookie-cutter answer for that one. I would love to dive deeper into this issue by inviting some guests, perhaps, with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China background to weigh in. Maybe in some future episodes. What do you think?
Oh, that sounds like an intriguing idea. But now, in the last episode, you mentioned about co-chairing former Premier Ujjal Dosanjh's campaign in Vancouver South. And as a result, you made many friends in the Punjabi community.
That's right, Charlie. I absolutely made many friends in the Punjabi community. In politics, never underestimate the importance of boots on the ground, especially when they're from the Indo-Canadian community. I had also done a tremendous amount of door knocking, as we discussed in previous episode. My supporters felt that I had the advantage, especially if we worked harder than Mason's team.
Well, hard work is your brand, so you make a good point, Wendy.
Thank you, Charlie. Let me tell you, we worked so very hard to win that nomination. Mason was endorsed by some well-known Liberals like former Vancouver councillor May Brown, and the former MP Sophia Liang, and Senator Mobina Jaffer, and etc. But I had lots of support from those who backed Port Martin's leadership campaign. I also had solid support from many community leaders by then, and lots of my business friends, and also many volunteers. So we had an army of volunteers for sure.
Well, that sounds quite amazing, Wendy. I'm curious how things played out between you and Mason.
Oh, the nomination was scheduled for July 2006, I remember. Remember that big German social club at the corner of Victoria Drive and East 33rd?
Oh, of course, the Alpen Club. It's still there.
Yes, that's where the nomination was held. And my nomination was co-chaired by Mike Hillman and Helen Wei. Both of them are good friends to this day. But here's something very interesting. The day before the party notified us of the nomination date, Helen flew to Shanghai for a vacation because no one had any idea that the nomination date was coming so soon. So when we got the date, I called Helen immediately, I remember, and I said, "Hey, Helen, where are you?" And guess what? She had just landed in Shanghai.
That's amazing. What a turn of events.
Yes, I told Helen that the battle is on and that we didn't have much time to get prepared, and I needed her to immediately fly back to Vancouver. And she did just that. Helen turned around, hopping on a plane in Shanghai, and flew back the next day. And when she arrived, I remember she did not even go back home to take a shower or anything. She just came with her luggage straight from the airport and joined all the volunteers at the campaign office.
What a remarkable act of generosity.
I know.
It's really incredible. Moving forward, what was it like on the nomination day, Wendy?
Oh, my team barely slept the night before, I remember. Some even arrived the night before to inspect the site and simply rested in their cars. They were so busy getting prepared for the next day. And when voting time started, the parking lot was already pretty full.
Wow, you sure had a dedicated team working tirelessly. It sounds like around the clock.
Yeah, I'm so blessed. Mike Hillman and Helen are not only just hardworking, they're also very smart people. After all, Mike is an old political hand. And Helen also picked up lots of on-the-ground experience when she helped on Wuzhou's campaign. Remember, our team was divided between the two candidates back then, the David Emerson and Wuzhou's camps for the 2004 general election. And, with all that being said, people only had a few hours to cast their ballots.
Well, this makes me wonder, did Ujjal Dosanjh's Indo-Canadian team deliver for you on nomination day?
Oh, it's funny you should mention that, Charlie. We signed many members from the Indo-Canadian community, and they promised to show up to vote for me. But very few came in the first 3 hours, because the whole thing was only 4 hours. By the fourth hour, our team, as well as myself, were really getting anxious and nervous. But in the last half an hour, just as the voting station was to be closed, a whole bunch of them showed up. Kashmir Dhaliwal, the head of the temple, was leading the crowd. There were many big families, I remember, of like 6, 8, or 10, big families. And yes, they voted. And lots of them stayed for the counting of the ballots and results as well.
Amazing. That sounds so exciting. And Kashmir Dhaliwal is very well connected and respected in the Punjabi Canadian community. And it looks like they kept their promise. They showed up for you on E-Day.
I know, yes, indeed they delivered. The atmosphere was pretty tense and even a bit chaotic towards the last half an hour, I remember. And when the returning officer, Don Grant, announced that we had won, Oh, those big Indo-Canadian guys, including Kashmir, put me on their shoulders. They were trying to throw me in the air to celebrate. I still remember vividly to this day how the big crowd of supporters and our volunteers celebrated. They shouted in excitement. The scene was just electric. We were so happy. Countless days of hard work finally got paid off. All the mainstream media, as well as the Chinese media, were on site to cover the story. It was huge.
That was a wild scene and a memorable moment in politics. To me, Wendy, it's fascinating that the Indian community got behind the candidate originally from China. Because as you know, India and China have not always been on the best of terms.
Yes, and it was really fascinating to see this unity, and that was historic. Apparently, it was the first time in BC's history that Indo-Canadians and Chinese Canadians worked so closely in a nomination race. It goes to show that together we can make a difference. Regardless of the differences between our former home countries, we can support one another in Canada and to be friends. That's the story of Canada. I made lifelong friendships from the campaign. It's truly, truly amazing.
And it's also heartwarming to see the connections between communities. But it was also a long road for you to that nomination win.
It certainly was, Charlie. This came after I had volunteered on many different community boards. This came after I worked on Paul Martin's leadership campaign. And this came after I had to step aside for David Emerson in 2004. And this came after all those meetings and work as Paul Martin's representative in BC. And this came after countless hours of door knocking.
Just unbelievable. So much work. And you certainly came a long way, Wendy, and I would say it was a well-deserved win. How did Mason Loh react after losing the nomination to you?
Oh, he wasn't happy, but I think he sort of underestimated us. He actually launched an appeal of the results with the Liberal Party of Canada.
Yeah, he appealed, and that was a big news story back then, I can remember.
I know. He claimed that the party was favoring me with the early nomination date. Mason said that he didn't have enough time to sign up members, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And why on earth did Helen fly all the way to Shanghai if you had known the nomination date was coming? It doesn't add up.
I know, you're absolutely right on the dot, Charlie. You know, we had no idea either that the nomination date was going to be scheduled in the summer. Many of our members that we signed up were also back in Asia for the summer, or they were out of town on vacation. So we were actually worried all this time that Mason might have the ability to convert many of our signups to vote for him. That's because he had a high profile in the community, and he also knew many of them anyway.
That's interesting. I would like to know more about how the procedure works in these nominations.
Oh, yeah. This nomination procedure can be complicated. For instance, when the nomination was officially called, the party would release the signed membership list to all nominated candidates. That means each candidate could reach out to the entire membership list by either calling or meeting with them in person.
I see. I'm learning something new every day. And I do remember, though, that Mason was not able to overturn the result after the appeal.
No, he wasn't able to get the results overturned. You're right, Charlie. I like Mason. In fact, I respect him a lot. We also have many mutual friends, such as Johnny Fong. Johnny, a lot of people know, he's a very well-known Chinese community leader, and he's also a famous philanthropist. So some years later, Mason and I had a chance to talk things over, and I think we understand one another, and I consider him a friend now.
Oh, that's nice to hear. But this nomination race was actually a landmark event in Canadian politics. I still remember It was big in the news, and you even made it to the cover of Maclean's magazine. And it was actually the first time that a candidate from China had won a major nomination race for a winnable riding with a major federal political party in Canada, and that's historic.
Oh, thank you, Charlie, for saying that. You get it. Not everybody understands how a party nomination works. You're quite amazing. I'm very humbled, and I'm very thankful to all my wonderful team and family and all the hardworking volunteers who made it possible. I actually did not expect that I would be able to win this battle against Mason, since Mason had been around a lot longer than me in the community. And he also had a very high profile, as we discussed. He was a big QC, and he was also a community leader.
Well, that leads to this question. What conclusion, if any, could you draw from winning this nomination?
Oh, in Chinese, we have a saying that 初生牛犊不怕虎, which means a newborn calf is not afraid of tigers. I would say as long as you have convictions and a passion for politics, and as long as you're doing this for the right reason, you owe it to yourself to give it a try. This especially applies to young people who want to go into politics. And that's the conclusion I basically drew from this winning nomination race.
Well, on that great note, we're about to conclude this episode, but I would like to bring up one more thing before we go. It's interesting to me that your nomination race with Mason was occurring just as so many people, and especially voters in Kingsway, were so angry at David Emerson for joining the Conservatives.
Yeah, it was a little crazy in those days. There was also a group I remember called Campaign to de-elect David Emerson. I remember they used to hold community meetings. They even hired a chartered plane to fly over Parliament Hill. It had a banner saying, David Emerson, call home. Emerson, of course, he made the case that he could help BC by being part of Stephen Harper's cabinet. To Emerson, the partisan line, I think, was a blur. But not everyone accepted this argument.
Yeah, that was definitely reflected in the overwhelmingly angry reaction of the voters in Vancouver Kingsway. In our next episode, we can discuss your thoughts on the Liberal leadership campaign to replace Paul Martin. National unity was a big issue, and you can share your thoughts on this as a former resident of Montreal, as well as a candidate. Until then, I'm Charlie Smith, and my co-host is Wendy Unfiltered. If you like what you see on Wendy Unfiltered, subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends. You can also follow this podcast on social media channels listed below. I hope you can join us for our next bi-weekly episode. Until then, take care.